Hello, everyone. It's Bishop Megan, and we are here to have another conversation about theology and a book that I would like to lift up for folk to consider. And so I have an esteemed guest with me today. Guest, would you be willing to introduce yourself?
Hi, good afternoon, everyone. My name is Kwok Pui Lan. Kwok is my family name. I put it first to honor my Chinese heritage. I was born in the former British colony of Hong Kong, and that is why I have been paying attention to the post-colonial situation around the world. And believe it or not, Bishop Megan, when I was a teenager, I had a woman priest. Yeah, in Hong Kong. So when people say Christianity is very patriarchal, I have another perspective. So I think that I have been nurtured to be a feminist from early on. And then when I started to do theology in Hong Kong, not many people, of course, look like me, women, and who is also from a working class family. So I have been interested in politics and its relationship to theology for quite some time.
Well, and I'm very excited to have you here because I, of course, here I'll hold your book up. I have read your book, Postcolonial Politics and Theology: Unraveling Empire for a Global World, and it's out right now. If people are interested in it, or if they need gifts for someone who likes nerdy theology books, I highly recommend it. But I'm wondering if before we start kind of diving into the book you've written, if you'd share a little bit about some of the intersections that you identify with.
I have worked in different intersections, as you said. First of all, I became interested in contextual theology, and that was in the 70s and 80s, when many theologians like C.S. Song and others were thinking about how theology can address the context of a very rapidly changing Asia. And then later, I became interested in Asian feminist theology. I was one of the first cohorts of women writing from the Asian perspective. And later, when Hong Kong was then returned to China in 1997, I became more interested in postcolonial theology, thinking with my colleagues in Hong Kong how we, as people of faith, will address a rapidly changing situation, not only in Hong Kong, but many, many different challenges in post-colonial Asia and in other parts of the world.
Well, and we share that in common. I studied with C.S. Song, and that's who taught me systematic theology. And I also was able to study with Bu-Young Lee and Paul Chung. And so I have an affinity for people who see the world and see the image of God kind of in a storytelling way and in a way that acknowledges that the world is bigger than we are. And so I'm really grateful that we have some siblings in our theology journeys.
Yes, Dr. C.S. Song has been a very important mentor for me. And as some of you know that Dr. Song is from the Presbyterian Church in Taiwan. And so he has been talking about using people's story as a way to do theology. Theology is not about reading other people's work. It is drawing from your own life experience and thinking about what God has to do with you and also with the world.
Well, one of the things that you write about that I think is an important concept that maybe some people haven't heard about before, if depending upon like, from if you think about it from the ushers to the people at the top who are deacons or pastors, not everyone's heard of the term kind of Eurocentric biases. Would you be willing to talk a little bit about what that means for people who might not have heard about it before?
Yeah, I think this is a great question. Why? It is because when I studied theology, beginning in the 70s, we have been reading mostly European theologians, such as Bonhoeffer, Barth, and Schleiermacher. And so in my training, these very important European theologians shaped the discourse. And during that time, they were responding to the challenges after the Second World War in Europe, many of them. And so we were trying to think with them, but their circumstances were very different from ours. And Eurocentric bias means that is, in theological tradition, we placed importance in Europeans' voices. Now, you can certainly see that Asia after Second World War was very different from the situation facing the European theologians. And that is why when I was a student, I thought I was very busy answering other people's questions instead of dealing with my own context or the questions arising from our own situation. And later, when I became a professor in theology, and I tried to expand my students' horizon to think not just like European theologians do, but to grapple with the issues that they face in their communities and in their churches.
Yeah, thank you. That's really helpful. For those who want to read and learn more about it, you go really in depth into some of the history of racial discrimination and racial ideology that has kind of gone through the history of religion, and talked about some of the ways that that's been problematic. One of the things that really struck me is that you also spent some time talking about the ways that these racial dialogues influenced conversations about sexuality. And I'm wondering if you could talk a little bit about some of the ways that sexuality, or conversations about sexual theology, became a part of this kind of process.
Yeah, can I begin to answer you by talking about the March incidents in the Atlanta neighborhood? Because you recall that in March, 8 people were murdered in around Atlanta, and 6 of them, unfortunately, were of women of Asian descent. When that happened, I was teaching a class called Asian and Asian American Theologies. So obviously, we needed to talk about that incident. We became aware that there were certain stereotypes about Asian women and why this white man would go to the Asian or Asian American massage parlor, and why would this man pick on 6 Asian women. And then you recall that the Asian women portrayed in mass media, they were hypersexualized. And now, when we even talk about the incidents that happened in massage parlors, it became difficult to talk about within our Asian and Asian American community. So it is not just about race. Race always intersected with sexuality and with other axes of power dynamics. So I'm concerned that we do not just use one single axis of analysis, but use an intersectional approach to talk about the race, gender, and sexuality, the intersection of all this.
Yeah, I really appreciated your writing about that, because I thought I didn't know very much about the March 1st and the May 4th movements, and so I thought that was very helpful to kind of like learn more about them, um, and particularly to think about some of the ways that, even the ways that Western or Eastern theology is trying to kind of like maybe have its own vision, but there are some ways that it's kind of connected to economies that make it kind of globally a part of, partially at least a part of, kind of a Eurocentric worldview. But I'm wondering, for those who might not be familiar with theologies in Korea and in China, if there are some things that you would lift up as touchstones or pieces that are really helpful for people to know about as they begin learning more.
Yeah, Bishop Megan, I am reading a book that talks about the 4 wars that the US have fought in Asia, and is significant for understanding the world and the American politics today. Because you recall that since the late 19th century, there was the war in the Philippines. And then afterwards, when Japan became a rising power, and then you have the Pearl Harbor incident, and so United States became involved in the Second World War. Later in the 50s, we had the Korean War, and of course, in the 60s, we have the Vietnam War. Now, if we as a country and as a people have not learned from those 4 wars, and then we repeated what we have failed to learn in our engagement in other parts of the world. In the 70s, United States became involved in the Middle East. And today, people were comparing the Vietnam War and especially the withdrawal of the troops with the withdrawal of the troops from Afghanistan. And I think it is important to talk about Asian Pacific today, and especially given where you are located, that is facing the Pacific. That what kind of political relations that would be something that we need to pay attention to. And as people of faith, how do we prepare ourselves, prepare faith communities to respond to the changing politics? I am of Chinese background, as I said, so I have been also watching the rise of China very carefully in the last several decades. China presented not only an economic challenge and not just an ideological challenge to the United States, it is also a cultural challenge as well. And so, as people of faith doing theology in the 21st century, we cannot just look back to Europe. It is important to recognize that legacy. But we are facing a changed world. Even politicians are talking about pivot to Asia. And shouldn't we, as people of faith, pay some attention to the changing geopolitical situations we are facing that is going to shape the future not only of humanity, but the planet for years to come?
Yeah, I've done some traveling kind of throughout Southeast Asia, and it's very palpable the ways that United States war activity has reshaped the area and reshaped the dynamics that people have, particularly with, folk who look like me who are traveling, and ways that we need to still kind of be working on reparative work and peace building and solidarity. And one of the things that made me hopeful about your book was the way that you described us doing this work of peace building and solidarity being interreligious, that we could do it with partners from lots of different kind of religious groups. Would you speak about that a little bit?
Yes, I think that we have been talking about interreligious dialogue since the 60s, the Vatican II and also the World Council of Churches have been promoting this idea of dialogue. Before that, we assume everybody needs to be converted, to be brought into the Christian fold in order for them to be accepted or in order for them to receive salvation. Today, we broadened our horizon and understand people do have different religious traditions or they have other spiritual paths. Bishop, you know that the faster growing group would be the nuns, right, in the United States, those who do not have any religious affiliation or do not want to declare so. And facing a tremendously religiously pluralistic society, how can we dialogue with the kind of open-mindedness and respect so that we can work together to solve problems that humankind together are facing? So it cannot be just from the Christian community alone. We must invite our religious neighbor to join us. Climate change is a big thing, isn't it? Even how to think about it, what kind of responses that we need to develop together. And facing such kind of crisis, we cannot rely on ourselves alone.
Yeah, I agree with you, and I appreciated that you not only like suggested that we do this, but you outlined a way that we could do it that might be helpful for like moving forward and caring for some of the particularities. And I won't I won't tell everyone what all of the 5 things are. They got to go buy the book and then read it. It's on page 175, people, if you want to look it up. But I like that there is a process for kind of repenting or asking for forgiveness for missteps of the past, included in your way of kind of moving forward. There's an acknowledgement of our differences. There's an acknowledgement of a need for continued learning. There's an acknowledgement of ways that we can maybe step more lightly together when we're trying to do this peace building work. And so I just wanted to name that I appreciated that you not only like lifted up this like an idea, because so often when people are like, you know what we should do, we should work with other religions and we should be more peaceful. But what I appreciated that you were like, and here's the things we really have to consider if we're going to do the work correctly. And so I just wanted to like lift that up as a place of appreciation, because I think you've put a lot of time and thought and care and concern into making sure we're not replicating those patterns that you write about earlier in the book about how we've just kind of pushed one ideology on a space. And so I just really appreciated that.
It is because I think that I've been teaching in theological institutions, preparing my students for different kinds of ministry. Some are going to parish ministries and others in various forms of social ministries. And I have always been thinking, how can my teaching be related to what they are going to do in the future? That is why when I began to do postcolonial theology, it's very heady, isn't it? That is, or to think about how postcolonial insights can be applied to the Bible, okay? But then gradually, there are people who are teaching homiletics who invited me to talk about, okay, how should I be teaching the students to preach, okay? And others will say, yeah, there is field education too. How can we apply some of these insights to field ed or to pastoral care? Wow, I have not thought about those things before. It is not like I have solved all these problems and have something to give. So I went to talk with my colleagues and really try to learn from their disciplines, from what they were thinking. And then it is through this kind of dialogical process, then I became aware that I need to pay more attention to the practice part of it. It's not just the thinking. How do you do? How do you preach? You know? And so I had great fun experimenting with my students, leading worship, and try to do preaching differently and to stretch our mind and our horizon. So I include those things in the book because I struggle with some of those issues myself.
I love that idea of thinking about the way that we are in a worship service as being the ways we practice our theology with each other. I'm going to sit with that idea because I really adore this idea that we're not just people who use one part of our body to learn about how God works in the world. And then on Sunday we sing and do standing up and sitting down, depending upon where we worship. But this idea that we're putting into practice the things that are most important to us. I like that imagery.
Yeah, talking about worship, I am Episcopal, and Bishop comes from the Lutheran tradition, and both of the traditions emphasize liturgy and the sacrament. And I have been thinking about sacrament is always a mystery to me. And I want to share with you, I always learn from my student. A student recently in a final project talk about the sacrament can be very exclusive to some of the people that the church would not accept. Well, that made me think about, I think about sacrament as grace. And then for those people who are excluded for various reasons, whether it's because of sexuality, of color, the sacrament becomes a tool of oppression that really makes me think about what we do and what we tell, what the church is all about, and how can the church be open and really inclusive of everyone. And we had that discussion in some of the Episcopal churches too. That is, if people are not baptized, would you allow them to receive communion or not? Again, they pushed our boundary, isn't it? And our theology. And in what way we can honor a very inclusive gospel, but also recognize that we do have identities, right? That is Christian identity and Christian formation. So I think those are very important questions when we talk about the practice of it. It does not stay in the mind only, right? It is really who will you be accepting and welcoming.
Well, and you also write a lot about eco-justice too, right? Like that it's not just about people-centric ways of seeing the world, but also thinking about the ways that we can repair the earth and prevent doing more damage to the earth, but thinking about creation as a larger part of this conversation. I wonder, would you be willing to explain, for those who maybe haven't heard the term eco-justice before, a little bit about what that is?
Yes.
Yeah.
Today we talk about climate change. And then we face so many disasters, right? Wild fire, tsunamis, and then we just had this tornadoes that is unfortunately taking the life of so many people in the United States. And sometimes we wonder why we have all these climate crises. And now we have a new term that is called Anthropocene that names a particular historical age, that is the age that we are currently in, that human beings, because of our activities, had done something that is really harmful to the whole environment, polluting the rivers and also the CO2 emission. We tend to think about ourselves and our generation, but our Native American colleagues have been reminding us to think about 7 generations. Eco-justice means not only social justice for human beings, it is what we have done to the planet and to the planetary processes too. If we do not do something that is drastic differently than what we have done, I think we together as human beings will be facing tremendous challenges together. Talking about the pandemic, if this do not help us to think we are together as one human family, then I wonder what can help us to at least begin to think about climate justice, which is so broad a topic. How do we think about the millions of years or whatever when we think about the carbon cycle, right? We can't even wrap our brain to think about this alternative time scale that when we are considering the natural environment. And today, I think we better read Genesis differently and not just putting human beings at the center, thinking that we are above everything else because we were created in the image of God. We really need to use a different lens, an ecological lens, to look at some of the Bible stories that we might have read differently.
Yes. I adore all of that. And I love the idea of even like this Advent story of Jesus being born into the midst of, cows and chickens or whatever we imagine in our nativity set, depending upon how we have built it, that like this idea of God being born amongst the animals and amongst all of creation as a reminder to do that as well too. Yeah.
And they are the magi who can reach the star, right?
Yeah.
We failed to have this kind of sensibility now. We did not have that sense of wonder, or at least we may not know how to read astronomical signs or signs from nature. So I think, as you say, there are a lot to take from that simple stories of the birth of Jesus, isn't it?
Yeah, I think so. I love that suggestion too. And we always like to ask people about some of the Bible stories that are speaking to them at this current time. You're also welcome. You listed a bunch of Bible texts that are particularly liberative to Korean women. So are there any Bible stories you'd like to highlight or recommend that people look at, or ones that are speaking to you right now?
I think in the season of Advent, we have to think about Mary, isn't it? Especially in the United States today. That is, reproductive justice cannot be taken for granted. And imagine this poor young woman, Mary, was given that kind of responsibility. Sometimes I think about Mary, I also think about Joseph, the circumstances leading to the birth of Jesus. I think this is a moment that we rethink that story and think about sometimes ordinary human beings can work with God to bring new hope and new blessing to humankind. And today, each of us, should think about what is our charge. How can we work with God, listen to the Spirit, and work wonders in the world? Advent is a time of waiting. I hope we spend some time to wait for that very important voice coming from God, from the Spirit in this season.
I appreciate that. Mary's story is one that speaks to me as well. And particularly, I think this year we're reading it through the lens of the Gospel of Luke. And so we get Elizabeth too.
Mm-hmm.
And so I just love the voices that are being lifted up through these times, and interwoven with Isaiah too. Isaiah has some really great justice stuff that is being lifted up as well. Yeah, I really appreciate that. Are there I guess one of my questions that I've had is that I've just been very aware of how this time that we've been living in pandemic has been particularly hard for some people in the AAPI community, and those who are particularly those who are residing in the United States. Is there anything related to that you might have as advice for ways that faithful people can be supportive of those who maybe are from the AAPI community, or things that you wish people would know so there was more cultural understanding?
Thank you very much for that question. That is very much in my mind. Because you recall that when former President Trump named the virus, this China virus or Kung Fu, and that gave almost license for people to think that, oh, the pandemic, this virus has been brought to us because of China or because of Asian people. And I do not know whether you have heard that is just within past several months, there were people of Asian descent killed or that is hurt for various reasons in Chicago. And also, I have heard stories like that in Boston. So this is ongoing. This is not, oh, wow, in the spring, we heard more cases, but it is still continuing. That is very troubling. Because with the rise of China, you have the stereotypical myths of that yellow peril, isn't it? That is, wow, it is a very populous country, okay? If they became stronger, and then they will take over the world. And I think that for API community, that we are very clear that sometimes we are sandwiched in the middle, so to speak. We are neither white or black. And that is why when we talk about racism in this country, I certainly would want to express my solidarity with my Native American colleagues and the Black and the Hispanic colleagues. But because the Asian stories did not get so much told, and when we heard from the mass media, it was so twisted. That is why I hope, because of this anti-Asian hatred, and we will then devote our time and energy to understand some of the history and stories coming from the API community.
Yeah, no, that's been weighing very deeply on my heart because I live in the San Francisco Bay Area, and we've had a lot of people who were attacked, and kind of throughout the last year and a half, there's been all violence is unacceptable, but an unacceptably alarming kind of amount of violence against the API community, and I just I pray that it decreases, but I also hope that like opportunities to like educate ourselves more about ways of thinking that might help us with that is a part of that journey of untangling ourselves from the ways that we might have participated in just only knowing Eurocentric ideas about theology or about academic wisdom. And so I think, would you, I mean, I didn't tell you I was going to do this, but would you be willing to talk about some of your other books as well so that people can know more about them?
Yes, I have a small book that's going to come out next
Okay.
year, which is going to be interesting because it's going to talk about planetary spirituality for our age. So I want really to address climate change and what kind of spirituality will help us to mobilize ourselves and others in order to address that question. So I talk about using an ecological lens to read the Genesis story. Okay. Now, have you heard, Bishop Megan? The Genesis story can be read from the Earth's perspective.
Wow.
Yeah, isn't that interesting?
I love that.
Yeah, so it is not from the human beings.
Yeah.
That is, at first, Earth was not revealed. Okay,
Yeah.
you see, you have to pull back the water, and then you have the Earth revealed, and then the human beings came, and of course, you can decide whether human beings created conflict or not. You see, because of our appearance. When I first heard about this Genesis story from the earth perspective, I was intrigued because I was not brought up to read it that way, isn't it? So I talk about, oh, you can use this to talk about Psalm 2 or other parts, Isaiah, okay? And then I talk about interreligious learning. So this is a small book that is going to come out in next spring. I have worked on also biblical interpretation. My other book, Discovering the Bible in the Non-Biblical World, really from Asia. And I also had a lot of fun writing that book.
I recommend that book too. It's a good one.
Thank you. Yes,
Yeah.
it's very, very kind of you. Yes.
Yeah. Well, and let us know when the new book comes out too, so that we can get a copy or two for our Synod Resource Center, so that people can check it out. I want to read it. Maybe you'll come back and chat with us about it too.
I'd love to. Yes.
Yeah.
Mhm.
I wonder if there is anything we haven't talked about yet that you think it might be good for folk in our area to know or to learn about.
Yes. I want to talk about a course that I'm going to teach. I want to share with you why I teach this course online. because I was attending a seminar organized by another seminary. It invited people from the Buddhist, Native American, and also Christian perspectives to talk about spirituality during the pandemic. I was so moved. I said, oh, if it is so helpful for me, and opportunities like this would also be helpful for others, I began to think, as someone who has taught theology and spirituality for decades, what can I offer to people who are feeling distressed, anxious during the pandemic? I don't know whether you know, for over 2 decades, I taught courses in spirituality. I think theology is the thinking or reflection about faith. Spirituality is the practice of it. That is why I'm going to teach a class, Spirituality for the Contemporary World, open to people in the community who want to audit. Don't need to write the papers or do exercise, but I want to offer this as a small gift to those who are, during the pandemic, reflecting on their spiritual paths. Shouldn't we do things differently for ourselves, for our church? What are the sources of hope during this time? And I am going to test out where this is possible. When I teach those courses, it's really embodied. So my challenge is, how can I do something like this in an online Zoom class? Okay, how can I teach Tai Chi? Okay, like this. Okay, and how can I teach meditation? So I think one of the challenges will be, how are we going to do ministry online? Whether you like it or not, this is not going away. I don't think after the pandemic we'll go back just business as usual. So this is a virtual environment. How can we do ministerial formation or spiritual formation in this online format? I hope together we find ways of doing it. You recall that in the beginning of the pandemic, wow, churches, right, pastors, we were all trying to do it, and some of us more successful, more skilled, isn't it? But I think this might be something I want to learn. I want to try out.
Well, yeah, please send Catherine information about that class. I might want to sneak into that class. And I think there might be some other folk. I know there was my doctor once, I'm someone who has very low blood pressure, and so there's not very ways to like regulate that, because most people in the United States have very high blood pressure.
Yeah.
So they don't want you to go the other end of the spectrum. But I had a nurse practitioner once, and she prescribed me to learn Tai Chi.
Yes.
As a way of trying to like balance myself out and be aware more of being in my body. And so like I have this affinity towards kind of embodied ways of knowing and trying to like be in touch with my spiritual self. And so I'm very interested and excited to see some of your thoughts about how we can do that as people of faith and as people as embodied
Yes.
faith, right? And then also
Mhm.
beings on a planet that is faithful. And
Yes.
so
It's so simple as this. Let me just, you talk
yeah,
about embodiment,
yeah,
One thing you can
yeah.
see, one hand is pushing out,
Okay,
and then it come back, and then the other hand. Yes,
okay,
exactly, yes. Now, if you look at just the fingers, okay?
uh-huh.
Don't look at me. And then you slowly do this, as if you are pushing the energy. What we are doing, this Megan, is
Yeah,
to embody that yin-yang
yeah,
complementarity.
uh-huh.
That is, many people in the United States, we just know how to push
Yes,
out, isn't it?
yes,
We push
yes,
ourselves to death.
yeah,
We never have time to come back.
yeah,
So when we come back, then we take a break from this, isn't
yes,
it? And
yeah,
all you need to do is to be mindful of doing some simple exercise
Yeah.
that really release the mental energy.
Uh-huh.
So that is why when I learned Tai Chi, I also learned yoga. And then I
Yes.
want to learn what makes that work.
Yeah.
I, of course, read a lot of also scientific explanation of what we are doing. But that is it. Learning by doing.
Yeah.
You learn very complex concepts,
Yeah.
not by debating, by practicing. When we talk about Christianity, what kind of practice we need to develop? Maybe going to church, maybe prayer, maybe other things.
Mm.
How do we practice love?
Mm.
What are the skills that will help us for self-acceptance?
Mm.
Well, Jesus did many things, not just talking.
Mm.
So what were some of those practices
Mm.
that we needed to retrieve from 2,000 years of Christian tradition to help us today,
Mm.
facing not only the pandemic, but global reckoning
Mm.
of racism and also health crisis across the board, isn't it? And
Yeah.
so I think it is important that we think about Christian tradition in a much broader sense.
Mm.
I am going to try to reclaim some of those things we might have forgotten or we did not have time to practice, isn't it? Sometimes we know it is important,
Yeah.
but it is always in the back burner
Mm.
to have a time to think about our own spiritual path.
Mm.
Jesus said he has come so that we can live life abundantly. I'm sorry, many of us do not live life
Mm.
abundantly.
Mm.
So I hope we will have a chance to think together
Mm.
what kind of spiritual practices that will rejuvenate the soul,
Mm.
nourish the spirit, so that we can come closer to God.
Mm. Well, Pui Lan, that really touched my heart, and I hope that we can stay in conversation with you because your clear gifts for teaching are just palpable, and I hope that you can be a continued friend for our synod. And if there are ways that we can support you and the work that you're up to, I hope you'll let us know. If you haven't done it yet, people, by golly, get the book. Postcolonial Politics and Theology. Um, I hope that people will join you for your class. And I have really adored our time together. I feel like you have refilled my cup of living water, and so I'm so grateful for your being with us today.
Thank you so much for this invitation. I am so grateful that Bishop Megan, you have taken this educational ministry and formation so seriously, introducing not only books, but speakers from many different walks of life to enlighten the people and also to help share this great news to more people. Thank you so much for your very kind invitation.
Thank you.